This Focus on Health segment is brought to you by Aurora Healthcare.
Hello and welcome to Focus on Health. I'm Ted Stefaniak. Today we're at the Vince Lombardi Cancer Clinic at Aurora Medical Center in Oshkosh. Today we're going to be speaking with Dr. Shamsuddin Virani about clinical trials for cancer patients because there's been a lot of advancements in both treatment and research. Well, thank you for joining us today. You know, a lot of people who have to deal with cancer sometimes get the option of having a clinical trial. And people have heard of the term clinical trial, but what exactly is a clinical trial?
So a clinical trial is a clinical study which is supposed to add to the medical knowledge. It could be an observational clinical trial where you're just assessing information, or it could be an interventional clinical trial where you're, say, trying a new treatment or an intervention as opposed to the standard of care or the current standard of care.
Yeah. So why would a person go through a clinical trial?
So the Institute of Medicine in their report in 2010 addresses it in a very beautiful way, and they say there's three good reasons to go on a clinical trial. One is to address the questions that are of important or significant scientific implications or to patient care, for example. The second is to define the standards of modern healthcare. And the last one, which I think is very important to me, is to provide access to the patients for up-and-coming therapies that I wouldn't be able to otherwise. And the important factor here is the clinical trials are population dependent in a way that if a drug is in the long run supposed to be used in a certain population, for the results to be accurate and generalizable to the same population, you would need a good number of participation. You'd need a good participation from that very population. So I know how the drug interacts, how the intervention fares with our local population, rather than doing the clinical trial somewhere else in the world and bringing the results over. And the appalling fact is that for the past so many years, the U.S. clinical trial numbers have not been stellar. Let's say, for example, NCI is estimating that around 5%, or actually maybe less than 5% of the patients, cancer patients, adult cancer patients, are getting enrolled onto cancer clinical trials. Which, if you look at the numbers as opposed to the pediatric cancer patients, that is somewhere in the order of 70 to 90% if you look at the pediatric literature. And how does it make a difference, and why should you do the clinical trials in the first place? Just coming back to your question. So let's talk about pediatric ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. That's a most common malignancy, one of the most common malignancies in the pediatric population. And the article from NEJM, I think it's 2006 article by Pui et al., what it showed is the impact of subsequent improvement in therapy, but more so also the impact of participation in clinical trials. So ALL in the 1960s used to have a survival of around 10%. With better therapeutics and with enrolling patients onto those clinical trials that had the therapeutics, and with improving our care for these patients, acute lymphoblastic leukemia in this day and age has a survival of close to 90%. And that's the impact of clinical trials. And so
that doesn't happen unless the clinical trials are run.
Absolutely. The clinical trials are run, and that the people here participate in clinical trials.
And I guess what a lot of people would ask would be, are clinical trials safe? I mean, you're not just throwing a new treatment option at somebody. These have been tested and tested, so it's a relatively safe procedure, isn't it?
Right. So let's talk through what happens about a new intervention, let's say a new therapy, when it comes out. So it starts with the preclinical studies, and those could be animal studies, those could be cell-based studies. From there, it goes to a phase 1 clinical trial, and the researchers are primarily trying to find out what is a safe dose for that medication to be used. And how does it benefit the patients who are on phase 1 clinical trials? Of course, these are patients, let's talk about cancer patients. I'll call them early phase cancer trials, who've had multiple lines of therapy and have progressed on all of the standard of care therapies that are available. And this provides them a lifeline, but at the same point in time, it gives us new and more scientific knowledge about it. Then from there, it goes to a phase 2 clinical trial. And this is where we're looking for the efficacy of the drug, so getting even more data. How effective is it? And then lastly, it goes on to a phase 3 clinical trial, which is a large-scale clinical trial, again, looking at the safety and efficacy of the drugs or an intervention compared with the current standard of care. So there is a good amount of scientific data in the background, from preclinical studies to phase 1, phase 2, before this clinical trials come in the offering in the form of a phase 3 clinical trial or even a phase 2 clinical trial. So it's just not a random assortment, so to speak.
And the reason we're talking about it today is because Aurora is now one of the few systems in the country that is doing clinical trials.
Yes, so let me backtrack a little bit.
Sure.
And again, you asked me why clinical trials, and I don't know if you had the opportunity to read through the Time magazine article on closing the cancer care gap from March 2015. It takes you through the stories of two women who both have glioblastoma. One, I believe, is in the Dakotas, the other one in a place where she has access to clinical trials. And after she doesn't fare very well with the standard of care treatment, her doctors put her on clinical trials. And the second lady that we're talking about is doing really well on a novel medication that's up and coming, let's put it that way. And similarly, there was a 60-minute, again in March, on how scientists at Duke University are using a polio vaccine to treat a brain condition. And I think when I see that as a provider, as someone who supports the cancer care, I really get excited, I get enthused about all of the up and coming, because that is what I have to offer to my patients. So in an effort to bring these clinical trials close to home so that we can close that cancer care gap, what NCI has done is they've developed in August 2014 what's called the NCORP, or Community Outreach Program. And the NCORP, the purpose of the NCORP is to bring these clinical trials close to your home or in your communities as much as possible. And decrease the disparities, so everyone gets the same access to cancer care, whether you're in the Dakotas, whether you're in Wisconsin, whether you're in New York, or anywhere. And so there was a grant that was set out, and Aurora is one of the 34 national recipients of the grants. And so far, according to my current statistics, we have more than 50 clinical trials that are open through that particular grant. And there's more than upwards of 90 patients who have utilized those clinical trials, again in the community. And sitting here in Oshkosh, I have the same access to clinical trials as someone at Luke's in Milwaukee. And that, I think, is amazing. Yeah. And Wisconsin, I believe, has a Senate bill that was passed that sort of mandates the insurance providers to provide coverage for clinical trials. But what I would suggest is, people should talk to their cancer providers, people should talk to their doctors, and usually we have a whole team, a team that's dedicated to clinical trials, and we have one here at Aurora, and they can look into the coverage issues and make sure it's all covered for the patients, and I believe it should be a covered benefit, and it's part of the ACA too, the Affordable Care Act.
It is definitely an exciting time here at Aurora, and you're going to be able to help a lot more people. We appreciate you taking some time with us today to talk about this.
Thank you so much.
As you heard, Aurora is one of 34 hospitals in the country that's able to provide clinical trials, and the only one here in the Fox Valley. Now, if you have any questions, you can always get a hold of Dr. Virani at 303-8700. I'm Ted Stefaniak, and we'll see you next time on Focus on Health.
This Focus on Health segment has been brought to you by Aurora Healthcare.